Rock Duck.
Welcome, Savatage Legionnaires. Here we have all come together for one purpose: sabotage. Stay tuned.
Savatage.
We're going to get into the history, my backstory, Criss Oliva stories, 2025, and beyond. But more importantly, we are going to get into and talk about the elephant in the room. So, if you are a Savatage fan and looking forward to the next album, some claim it to be Curtain Call, although that is not confirmed, then you might want to stay tuned and pay attention to what we have upcoming, because we've got some secrets to delve indeed. Hello, my friends. Today we are going to get into the world of Savatage and some personal stories that I myself will be sharing. But we would like to go ahead and illustrate for those that are not familiar with the band a quick, short history of where the band came from, who they are, and why they are so important to all of us. Criss Oliva and his brother Jon, way back in the 70s. Now, you guys got to picture what it's like to be teenage brothers. Everyone accepts what the duo is today, right? The great Jon and Criss, and the addition later with Paul ONeill as a writing complement. But think what it's like to be in middle school, right? If not high school. Back in those days, 1 year, 2 years difference, you're in a whole nother category, right? So Jon and Criss didn't really associate so much with each other. Jon had his own thing going on. He had his own band. And so did Criss. Respectfully, those bands were called Tower, Alien. But Criss was persistent and really wanted to impress Jon. And he kept practicing, and he lived with the guitar. Everyone who talks about him says he slept with the damn thing, right? And so Jon said, yeah, fuck it. And they formed what became Avatar. Now, Avatar is where the prominence of the two brothers came up. The two bands retrospectively had been playing in the Tampa Bay area for a while and had garnered their own recognition. But the brothers teaming up and practicing out what became known as The Pit. With the bass player back then, Keith Collins, printing out a magazine also called The Pit, would self-promote the band in its infancy without it really being a real band, right? Just a bunch of happy-go-lucky musicianship guys that got together. Some had connections, some didn't, but they all had a passion, and that passion was to create rock music. So, Criss Oliva's persistence paid off, and he was able to persuade Jon to join forces and form the band Avatar. This band went on and recorded a couple of demos that infinitely became famous, as we all know. The dungeons are calling and sirens. However, the original demo, The Dungeons Are Calling, and when they went to release it, there was a band over in Europe that had the name Avatar, and they said, we're going to sue your fucking ass if you release it that way, so you need to change your name. the label called the Olivas, and Jon and everyone got together and in their quickness moved some letters around and added some letters, and they took Avatar and transmutated it into Savatage. Savatage! The band we are all familiar with today. That is the original formation of Savatage. And it consisted of guitarist Criss Oliva, vocalist Jon Oliva, drummer Wacholz, and bassist Keith Collins, who, like I stated earlier, ran a magazine also called The Pit, which was where they also rehearsed in a little shed outside the back in a yard that they called The Pit. Those that remember those days remember the true origins of what we now call original Savatage. And within this documentary, we will be breaking down the differences between original Savatage, classical Savatage, and new Savatage.
What about
As
post-Savatage?
the years that separate them and the people are miles and miles apart. Not so much to those that were involved,
We lived
but
it.
apparently to the crowd and to those listening, as it tended to wear on the band how they were chastised for such minor changes. And we will get into that more later, especially when we get into the elephant in the room. So stay tuned for more Savatage coming up. So, Avatar signed with a major label and became Savatage! And their first album, Sirens, which came out in 1983. And the following EP, The Dungeons Are Calling,
Dungeons Are Calling,
in 1984, were released on Par Records, an independent label. And in 1984, they signed a contract with Atlantic Records and released their second full-length album, Power of the Night, in May of the following year. Power of the Night, produced by Max Norman, showcased the band's unorthodox approach to metal, which included Jon Oliva's liberal use of keyboards on songs like Fountain of Youth and Broadway-style song structures like the kind employed on Warriors. It was well received by critics, but fell short of sales expectations by Atlantic Records, and, so therefore they budgeted less on the next album, those little bastards, but we'll get into that later. Jon was not impressed. They really were not going in that direction. And forcefully, they ended up releasing Fight for the Rock, a failed attempt at a commercial approach, which Jon never approved. However, the label kept pushing for things. And ultimately, the band was introduced to Paul ONeill. And that is where the true Savatage fans know that everything took a turn for a change. I won't say the better, because everything prior to that was really, really awesome, and who knows what would have happened had they stayed on that direction. But Paul ONeill took it in a whole new direction, and no one can deny that. We'll get into more of that next. Coming up was Savatage, a Criss Oliva story. Stay tuned. So, Savatage never really being financially successful and running into a lot of obstacles, and, it's just hard being on the road, right? It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. Now, the Oliva brothers, while never having financial success with the early Savatage original days, became acquainted within the industry. Criss Oliva was contacted early on by Megadeth to come and try out as a guitarist. And Jon Oliva was to go audition for Black Sabbath. Yes, Jon Oliva was requested by Black Sabbath to audition for lead vocalist. So what happened? Why did we not have a Jon Oliva Black Sabbath band and Megadeth with Criss Oliva? What happened? Well, Paul ONeill happened. Paul ONeill introduced himself and said, "You're not breaking up. I'm giving you a chunk load of money, enough to fix all your problems that you have right now today. And we're going to get this band up and going. The only thing I request in return is that you allow me to write with you guys." Jon and Criss said, "Sure, fuck it, why not?" And the rest, as they say, is history. Obviously, it wasn't that simple, but we all know that story. And you've probably heard it better than I told it. But we're just doing a short recap here so we can get into the meat and potatoes of this real video, which is some Criss Oliva stories I have, 2025 and beyond, and more importantly, the elephant in the room. So, stay tuned because we've got more to come. Savatage. So, as Jon Oliva always animatedly states when he gives interviews, who is this Paul ONeill guy? Where the heck did he come from? And the fact is, he ended up, he was always musical, going way back into the late 60s, early 70s. But he landed a position at Lieber Krebs Incorporated, right? And they were the management company that launched the careers of Aerosmith, AC/DC, Def Leppard, Ted Nugent, Scorpions, Joan Jett. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And he was the personal assistant of the manager, David Krebs. So, the position is at Lieber Krebs Incorporated, and he's directly involved with David Krebs. He's right at the tippy top, okay. And in the 1980s, ONeill became a large rock promoter in Japan. Now, keep that in mind because the Savatage live album is live in Japan. And ONeill promoting every tour, right, back then with the the Lieber Krebs Incorporated management company. He promoted every tour of Madonna, Sting in that decade, as well as the largest rock festivals in Japan at the time with Foreigner, Bon Jovi, Whitesnake, Ronnie James Dio, and remember, Savatage ended up touring with Ronnie James Dio as well. So all of these connections is how you can see everything comes together in one big melting pot of musical, camaraderie and just the times of what it was. But it all started at the Pit. Paul ONeill himself was personally at the helm of Aerosmith's Classic Live 1 and Classics Live 2 albums before beginning his relationship with Savatage. And it's that relationship that led to the conceptual artistic pieces that became Hall of the Mountain King. And of course, Gutter Ballet, Streets, a rock opera, and Dead Winter Dead. Magellan, and Poets and Madmen. And even though sometimes not directly involved, the influence that Paul ONeill had over the Jon Oliva's writing style can never be removed. Now, Paul ONeill was very instrumental in introducing people to other people because of his high connection at his job. And he was able to introduce Jon Oliva to Bob Kinkle, which is a phenomenal keyboardist, piano player, and Al Pitrellii, as we all know, the guitarist for Savatage after the demise of Criss Oliva, and also the guitarist for TSO, as well as his other endeavors. And he also reconnected with everyone in the studio with the engineer Dave Whitman. And this is phenomenal because all of these people were the instrumental key people that created what we now know as Trans-Siberian Orchestra, TSO. And so it's phenomenal how the beginnings stem from one thing, but the natural growth and acceleration of just what is to become naturally just becomes what it's going to become. Now, as fate would have it, nothing ever comes out as planned, and sometimes things come out better than you can plan. Everyone remembers that are true fans of Savatage of the project Romanovs, and that was one of the early conceptual concept albums between Paul ONeill and Jon Oliva, and they introduced that as one of the original concept albums to introduce Trans-Siberian Orchestra. Imagine that. That was supposed to be the leading album for TSO. But then the Dead Winter Dead album had a magical song on it.
Christmas Eve, Sarajevo.
And that song just took off on the charts unbelievably. And so the heads of, corporate all got together, and the money makers and everyone, you know how it goes, and they said, hey, why not put together a Christmas album? And again, as you know, the rest, as they say, is history. And TSO became widely known, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, for their Christmas-inspired music and albums, imagery, and everything else. Now, getting back to the origins of everything, artwork seems very important, and TSO had a renowned artist doing the artwork for Trans-Siberian Orchestra, and he's the same artist that did the artwork for Star Wars back in the 1970s, and that's worthy of mentioning. Early on, Savatage had many also renowned artists working for them. One of them was the renowned local artist going back to Tampa Bay again, called Gary Smith. And he worked for a lot of local bands. He worked for businesses and industry. I mean, he was just a local guy. He did the mural at ML Chasers, which is a rock club that Savatage would play at, as well as Dr. Butcher. And he also did a lot of other things. He was a renowned artist. He did artwork for the band Stranger, a very well-known Florida band going back from the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and now Greg Billings, continuing that legacy. These are all the memories that those that lived in the Tampa Bay era know and kind of rejoice back to. But getting back to the artwork, it inspired people to buy the album, right? They say don't judge a book by a cover, or don't judge an album by a cover, but in reality you do. And even after you buy the album, when you're listening to the music, you're staring at that album cover and you unify the music with that imagery, and it becomes vitally important. And I think Gary Smith had a lot to do with that imagery and what became known as the Savatage look and what everyone kind of expects as a Savatage album. He did the Hall of the Mountain King album cover. He did the Gutter Ballet cover. He did the Edge of Thorns cover. And then after that, Edgar Gerrans did most of the artwork with Dead Winter Dead and Wake of Magellan and Poets and Madmen. And Edgar Gerrans has a unique style in himself. Now, if you're curious still about Gary Smith, you can see him in the video Jesus Saves. He actually plays the character DT Jesus in the video. And when you watch that video from Savatage, Jesus Saves, that character, DT Jesus, that is played by Gary Smith, the artist that did the album covers for Gutter Ballet, Hall of the Mountain King, and the other one I forgot to mention was Handful of Rain, right? After Criss had passed from a horrible accident, being hit by a drunk driver coming back from livestock. Those are horrible memories, living through that. But we'll get to that later in the story. Right now I want to keep on topic with Paul O'Neill and his transformation of the band from where it started and its early roots musically and the direction that it took after that and how it ended up being the TSO project ultimately. But there was a lot of incarnations along the way, a lot of deviations, and a lot of interpretation. Now, Jon and Criss would often spend time in New York City, as well as the rest of the gang, Doc Wacholz and Johhny Lee Middleton, who the bass player ultimately replaced Keith Collins after they took off and got signed, as Keith Collins had other endeavors in Tampa Bay. He actually had a thriving business. I'm not going to go into the nature of that business, but it was kind of catty corner to the infamous Rocket Club on Dale Mabry. And the Rocket Club, as everyone knows, is infamous for getting the startup for a lot of bands, not just Savatage, but Rock's Gang, Saigon Kick, Erasmo, and so many others that we can go into that were national bands that would come down and play there, thanks to 98 Rock and 95 YNF that would always promote national bands and have the local bands open up for them and use these venues as a mechanism to do so. So those were great times, and everyone that lived back then just remembers the joyful time that it was, right? It really just was a unique time in musical history, and I'm glad to be a participant of it. But Paul O'Neill, what he introduced to the band, he took them to New York, not that they weren't already there anyway, which is where Paul O'Neill met Chris Caffery, who got introduced to Savatage later. Now that's an interesting story as well. So Chris Caffery met the lead singer for a band called Heaven in Times Square, and Heaven is a famous band from Australia back in the day. And he gave him Chris Caffery gave him a demo tape, right? He's like, hey, I'm a guitarist here, take my demo tape, I'd love to play with you guys or open up or whatever you want me to do. And ironically, the lead singer that he gave the demo tape to from the band Heaven, he contacted Chris Caffery and said, hey, we can use you as a guitarist, and by the way, if you know a drummer, we need a drummer as well here in the United States, right? Because the original drummer from Australia did not want to come over to do the tour. And Caffery's like, yeah, sure, my brother's a drummer. So Chris Caffery and his brother joined the band Heaven. Now, ironically, and here's how the story connects everything together, Paul O'Neill was one of the managers, again, going back to that company, that managed the band Heaven. And when he saw Chris Caffery and he kind of saw his potential, he said, hey, you need to go down to Tampa Bay. I know these people, you know, Jon Oliva and his brother, and they got this band Savatage, and they're kicking butt, but they just need some filler. They need something to kind of, you know, bring up that sound a little bit. And Caffery's like, yeah, sure, I'll go check it out. And again, as they say, the rest is history. As Criss Oliva or Chris Caffery became, in some people's opinions, over time, a lot more instrumental in the end game of what has transpired with the Savatage legacy and its continuation, and where it's gone post Savatage, especially with TSO. He's single-handedly run. TSO is so big, they have to run two bands on each coast during the season because it's a seasonal band. And Chris Caffery heads up one of those, and so he's done a lot. And he was also instrumental as a key player with Dr. Butcher, which, in my opinion, no one has mentioned, but is also a concept album. And I have actually put that concept album and all the missing pieces together on my YouTube channel. For those interested, it's listed under Dr. Butcher 30th Anniversary. Imagine that, Dr. Butcher 30 years old. So I wanted to celebrate Dr. Butcher and what Jon and Caffery had put together in its entirety, because they had released everything, but under different times and different pieces, and I just wanted everything in one place. I think that makes sense to everyone. So if anyone's interested in the Dr. Butcher project that Jon Oliva and Chris Caffery did, then definitely YouTube the Dr. Butcher 30th Anniversary, and it should pop up. I've got the entire thing there, and I tried putting it in order of what I thought the concept album should be, but I have not gotten a response from the guys as of yet to verify that it is correctly in that order. It's also got some hidden pieces and some missing pieces I was able to find over the interweb, and it's quite nice. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely go check it out. But getting back to the early days of Savatage and the Paul ONeill influence in New York, where they were rehearsing at the studio, Paul ONeill saw that Jon needed some a change up, right? He just needed he needed some inspiration. So he got him tickets to go to Broadway to see Phantom of the Opera, and that left that Phantom of the Opera on Broadway. Watching it live, right, left a lasting impression on Jon Oliva. So much so that his writing after that was forever changed. And I think a lot of people want to aspire to giving the credit to Paul ONeill for the huge change in the writing, but I really think it's the influence Paul ONeill had on Jon Oliva that actually inspired the writing. And I think the true writing did always come from Jon Oliva, with the guitar filler riffs that Jon was able to leapfrog from his brother. And that was a huge change up when his brother died from that creative writing process that Jon no longer could feed from. And he ended up finally finding that with Matt Laporte, who they went on and did Jon Oliva's Pain and wrote a lot of great songs. And we'll get into Jon Oliva's Pain and some of that stuff later. But keeping with the Paul ONeill story and what transpired is after Jon saw Phantom of the Opera, he came back and ended up writing what we now know as Gutter Ballet. And Gutter Ballet and the other songs on that album, which were so highly piano influenced, were written on the same piano that John Lennon, the same John Lennon from the Beatles, right? Paul McCartney, John Lennon, that John Lennon wrote Imagine. Imagine all the people, right? That song. He wrote the Savatage songs on that same piano. He was so inspired. And that forever changed Savatage to what it not only became at that moment, which now everyone knows as the classical Savatage, right? So this is where we distinctly divide original Savatage, which was the early days, more thrash metal and aggressive metal with Keith Collins, and then we get into the classical Savatage days, which incorporated Johhny Lee Middleton and Paul ONeill. And this combination of people is really what I think when people think of Savatage, that's what they think of. And we'll get into stories coming from Doc Wacholz himself a little later on. So if you're enjoying listening to this, please like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more Savatage, Criss Oliva stories, 2025 and beyond coming up. Now, even with all this great inspiration and the additional writing capacity that Paul ONeill brought to the table and the financial responsibility they brought to bring them up to top level quality and got them instruments and everything, it was amazing that the two albums produced initially, Hall of the Mountain King and Gutter Ballet, initially did not, produce the results that they wanted. Hall of the Mountain King even had a heavy rotation with a video on MTV, and Jon Oliva and the band itself would sometimes host Headbangers Ball on MTV in the early days. And if you guys have not seen that, I suggest you go to the YouTube and Google it or whatever it is you got to do, because it's quite interesting to see the early days when they were up and rising with the classical Savatage setup. And a lot of people just don't remember that they don't remember that there was a time that the Atlantic Records did promote them and the media attention was a little bit strong to them, but it just their musical style, I think, was not radio friendly. Their songs were a little too long, a little bit too aggressive, and even the ones that weren't were just too long. And I think ultimately they would get played at night and at other times, which is why they would develop a huge cult following ultimately. And their constant touring as well would also allow them to create a cult following. But they never really achieved that radio success until ultimately Jon Oliva decided to quit the band because of throat issues. And we won't get into all of that. You guys are fully welcome to go look into that. There's plenty on it on the interweb that you can learn from. But he decided to quit the band because of that. And that is when Zachary Stevens replaced them. And they ended up doing the album Edge of Thorns. And Edge of Thorns got played on Z-Rock radio network, which had over 100 radio stations, and they put it on a heavy rotation, a couple of the songs, and Savatage for once garnered some mainstream success somewhat, but then, as we all know, an untimely event at Livestock took the life away from one of the greatest guitar players ever, Criss Oliva, one of the founding members of Savatage, along with his brother, who took it hard, as all of us did, and that was in 1993. And I don't think the band, I know myself, I haven't, but I don't think anyone really has fully recuperated from those days, and I think that's why those are considered the classic Savatage days, especially the last album that Jon and Criss had together, which was Streets of Rock Opera, which, I mean, it's just garnered so much praise over time. Initially not well received, which was also one of the reasons I believe that John wanted to leave the band. He thought they would do better without him. Is my opinion on that. And he went with Chris Caffery and formed Dr. Butcher. So I have a hard time buying the whole throat thing when he immediately left and started another band and started immediately touring with it. I think there was other things involved that maybe they don't want to talk about or get into. But I welcome that because I'm pleased with the direction that both places went. I very much enjoy the Edge of Thorns album with Zachary Stevens singing as lead vocalist, the new vocalist for Savatage, and I also very much enjoy the Dr. Butcher ensemble that came out of that with Chris Caffery heading the guitar helm on that. But after Criss Oliva passed, that really changed the direction for everybody, including the label. And Jon Oliva had to take the helm back of the Savatage brand and came back in a full capacity almost on that. And out of it, we've got The Wake of Magellan and Poets and Madmen. And as we all know, Zachary Stevens left for personal reasons during Poets and Madmen after it was recorded and couldn't go on tour. So Jon Oliva came in and redid the vocals, and instead of recording all the music, Jon Oliva sang to match the key that it was played in for Zachary Stevens. That's how great of a singer Jon Oliva really is. And it's an awesome album because all the backup chorus and all the backup vocals still have Zachary Stevens singing on it, and it's one of my most favorite albums from Savatage. And I think a lot of you guys feel the same way, that we were enjoying the direction everything was taking, and everyone has that high expectation of the next album to come from the Savatage realm. Not that there hasn't been Savatage-esque things since, especially like we mentioned earlier, Jon Oliva's Pain with Matt Laporte at the writing helm of the guitar, and a genius at guitar. This guy is impressive in so many ways, and he is a local legend of St. Pete. He's also played with Crimson Glory, which is where we get Todd LaTorre, that is now singing with Queensryche, right? So the early days of the Tampa Bay era were just so immense, and it was so musical back then. But after the parting of Criss Oliva, everything really changed, and Dr. Killdrums ultimately, left the band. He had a very successful business, and touring with a band that really wasn't profitable didn't make sense to him. He had a family and everything else coming up, and he just, there was no animosity or anything, and he just felt like it was a better thing for him to take care of his needs where he was at. So that's why he left, and he was replaced by Jeff Plate. Initially, the guitarist for Testament filled in, but ultimately Al Pitrellii filled that role, that void, where Criss Oliva had left. And as we all know, Al Pitrellii is also very responsible for what became TSO. And again, like we were talking about earlier, a connection from Paul ONeill. It's just amazing remembering how everything started and where it came from, and then how it transpired over time from just innocent little, hey, I do this, and here's my tape, and hey, yeah, I do this, and hey, if you're here and you're there, can we meet up? And at the end of the day, it just all comes together. So it seems. I mean, that's a very simple way of putting it. Obviously, they did what they did well, and they had a lot of good reception to what they were doing and created a good fan base, especially a cult fan base, which, in my opinion, is better than a mainstream fan base, which I think is temporal, whereas a cult fan base, is pretty much, once you get a fan forever. And this is where we exit the classic days of Savatage and enter what we call the new Savatage. And a lot of people had issue with new Savatage, up into including the drummer himself, Dr. Killdrums, who referred to new Savatage as a cover band. And so you can imagine that if they were receiving that kind of criticism from their own band members, imagine what the fans were saying. And we saw it with other bands like Van Halen and, Black Sabbath when Ozzy Osbourne left, or Van Halen when his lead singer left. And they had a hard time replacing these people because at the end of the day, what people listening to the radio remember is the voice of the person singing. Remove that voice of the singer, and to most people, music is just music. But Dr. Killdrums went on, did his own things, and he's got a band called Reverence. And if you guys are interested, definitely go check it out. It's got a lot of great music, and he's doing what he does. And it's not like he stopped, right? When you are a musician, you are what you are. You just don't stop it. Chris Caffery, starting with Heaven, ended up with Savatage, and then continuing with Dr. Butcher. Now he's got Spirits of Fire. He's doing Chris Caffery of his own solo stuff, plus he's heading up TSO. I mean, all of these people, they do multiple things. Johhny Lee Middleton went from, Savatage to TSO. And so when we do this transition from the original Savatage to classic Savatage to new Savatage, it's interesting because originally, living through it, a lot of people just didn't accept it. And now in retrospect, looking back, people look at Wake of Magellan and Poets and Madmen as one of the some of the best albums that they put out, not to mention Dead Winter Dead. And all of these are post Criss Oliva. So when you live through it and you get everyone being naysayers, it's just so hard to continue because they're always pounding on, it could have been better with Criss, and could have, they're just, the comparisons get anal retentive after a while, and it's like, can't you just accept things for what they are and enjoy the music for what the music is, because it's such a beautiful piece of music. This is the reality of how it transpired. And so we have this void of Savatage, long gap of no new Savatage music. And what came out of it was TSO, Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And so that was the end of new Savatage and the creation of post-Savatage, which was Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And we'll get into more of that later. But a lot of people that say they're true Savatage aficionados and fans, a lot of them just do not like TSO. And again, we're going to talk about more of that later. But coming back, we're going to get into my backstory and how it all relates to why I'm here and why all this is happening on my channel and what's coming up in 2025 and beyond. And then again, we're going to get into the elephant in the room. So, if you guys are still here and you're still with it, then stay tuned because there's still more Savatage